Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. History. History is the story of people interacting with one another day in and day out, for better or for worse, trying to decipher their times and the events that surround them every day. That's why history is so endlessly fascinating, because it is the story of people. And our guest today, historian Gerard Gawalt, has some interesting insights into that, because for many years he has been the curator of presidential papers at the Library of Congress. So he has some insights into what made these great men tick as individuals like you and I. Gerard, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start out with your book, George Mason and George Washington, The Power of Principle. Now, what brought you to write this book?
Well, George Mason and George Washington were neighbors, and one of the papers I was responsible for was those of George Washington. And I became interested in George Mason, particularly while I was doing as curator of an exhibit called Creating the United States, of which George Mason had a prominent role. And when I was studying George Mason, I realized how interactive he was with George Washington. And so I thought, well, I think a dual biography would do better than just George Mason by himself. And so that's how I got involved in this.
Okay, so we all know who George Washington was, but some folks may not be as familiar with the career of George Mason, so maybe you could flesh that out a little bit for us.
Well, George Mason was 6 years older than George Washington. He lived on a neighboring plantation, which is called Gunston Hall. He was a friend of Washington through their youth. Mason was a large plantation owner. His father died when he was young, so he became responsible as the eldest son for about a 5,000-acre plantation. He owned more than 100 slaves, and he married young. He had 11 children. He was a busy person. He also was a magistrate, a tax collector, and together with Washington, they planned their plantation crops. They exchanged plants. Mason served in the Virginia Assembly for many years. He seldom left the state of Virginia except to go to Maryland, where his wife was from. And he was a man of basically self-educated. He became one of the leading constitutional authorities in the state of Virginia. And he was a person who felt that individual rights were important and that it was important for the province of Virginia and later the state of Virginia that they have control over their own government affairs.
Now, it's often been said he was like a precursor of the Bill of Rights. Is that?
Yes, he did draft the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is an antecedent document to the Bill of Rights. And he was a person who thought that the Bill of Rights was very important. In fact, one of the reasons that Mason and Washington fell out was that in the drafting the federal Constitution in 1787, Mason wanted to include a Bill of Rights, and other delegates to the convention didn't think it was important, and that was one of the points where they fell apart. But he thought that religious education was very important. He thought that freedom of religion was important, freedom of speech, newspaper independence was important, that the people in short had rights to protect them from what he would consider an oppressive government, which started out to be the British government, and then he later came to see the new federal government as having the potential to become an aristocracy or a monarchy, and that was one reason why he wanted a Bill of Rights included.
So why is it that he and Washington fell out? Because, you know, famously, Washington rejected becoming a king.
Yes, he did, but Mason's big fear was that the federal government would become too strong. He actually wanted to have a three-person executive, which of course didn't go over well with Washington, who assumed he would be the first president, even though he always said, well, I don't want any higher office, which was the standard line for the day. But everybody knew he would be president. Mason wanted a three-person executive. He wanted a federal government that was actually weaker than the states' governments. In other words, he was a states' rights person. And partly because Washington had led the American Revolution, he was the national figure in the United States, and he saw the need for a strong federal government, a strong federal judiciary, power to tax, none of which the Continental Congress had had, and he saw the need for these. Mason, who had almost never left Virginia, had a more provincial view of what the Republican government should be. And they fell apart on this point, that the principle that Washington thought a federal strong government was important. Mason thought that a weak federal government with strong states government was what should constitute a republic.
Interesting. Now, of course, in the final Constitution, we did get a Bill of Rights, so obviously it was, you know, an evolutionary process, and of course Jefferson was the father of that.
Well, the Bill of Rights wasn't adopted until the 1790s. It was, people wanted it, suggested it for the federal Constitution, but Mason didn't actually like the Bill of Rights as was adopted in the first U.S. Congress and sent to the states, because he thought it was a diversion from from weakening the federal government. He wanted amendments that would weaken the federal government. In fact, he called the Bill of Rights that Madison ushered through the Congress a tub for a whale, by which he meant there was a popular story then in which a ship sets sail around the world. It's attacked by a whale. This is a precursor to Moby Dick. Anyway, the people on the ship throw a tub out to divert the whale, and so it was called, a diversion was called a tub for a whale. And Mason called Madison's Bill of Rights, that was adopted, as a tub for a whale, because it diverted what Mason considered to be important changes that needed to be done in the federal government, and he wanted a second constitutional convention, which Madison rightly saw that once people had a Bill of Rights that protected individual rights, they would be diverted from a second constitutional convention. They could argue there was no need for them. We have a Bill of Rights. And so Mason was not a happy person over the Bill of Rights.
Mason apparently wanted a second bite at the apple to water down the
Yes, he did. And
government.
Nobody else, well, not nobody, other anti-federalists, as they were called, wanted to have a second constitutional convention. But most of the leaders of the country saw that this would bring chaos and would be an endless discussion. And
So now, obviously, Washington and Mason had a close personal relationship, which predated the revolution. Did that survive this controversy?
No, it did not. Mason, it didn't survive partly because Washington thought that after Virginia had ratified the federal Constitution, that Mason would then support the federal Constitution. And Mason refused. In fact, he refused even to take the new oath of office to be a magistrate in the District of Columbia, which included Alexandria. And then he refused to serve as a senator in the new federal constitutional government. He was elected a senator by the Virginia Assembly, and he said, I refuse to serve in any government that I haven't approved. Those were his words. Mm-hmm. And which led Washington then to reply to one of his friends in a letter that explaining why this friend, James Craig, wrote to Washington and said, basically, I don't understand why Mason won't support the government. And Washington listed a couple of reasons, principled reasons. And then he said that the real reason was that pride and a lack of manly candor were the reasons that Mason wouldn't approve the Constitution. And when Mason died, when he was told Mason had died, Washington referred to him as a quondam friend, somebody who had been a friend but had lost that name. And it's a shame because for decades, Mason and Washington worked extremely closely together, bringing on the American Revolution, fighting the American Revolution, and even before that, when they were both members of the Ohio Company. In fact, it was Mason that helped get Washington his start in his political career by having him named one of the Lord Lieutenants in the province of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And Washington then was sent by Mason and other members of the Ohio Company and the governor to the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela River, where the French were moving into the Ohio Valley. This Ohio Company was building a fort at that same spot, and they sent Washington there in 1753 to tell the French to get out, which he did. Of course, they didn't pay any attention to him, because who was going to listen to basically a 22-year-old person telling the French to move on? But then the next year, the provincial governor sent Washington back, again with Fairfax's support and Mason's support, back to the what was to become Fort Duquesne, what's now Pittsburgh, to tell the French and their Indian allies to leave. And they didn't. Washington became involved in a firefight with the French and Indians, killing a French officer, and that was basically the start of the 7 Years' War. So since then, from 1753 on, militarily and politically, Mason and Washington were very closely aligned. They worked together on the non-importation agreement for Virginia. They both wrote the Fairfax Resolves, which were a list of grievances against the British government in 1774.
Well, Washington had some choice words about Mason. Did Mason have any choice words about Washington?
Well, he thought that the Washington's government was leaning towards a monarchy or an aristocracy. He said Mason thought that the federal government, as it was set up, would become an aristocratic government, if not a monarchy. But Mason really had no harsh words for Washington. He did think that his vice president, John Adams, was really the monarchist, and that if it weren't for Washington, being such a strong character that it would become a monarchy.
Well, certainly Adams had a very big ego and thought a great deal of himself. Let me ask you another question. It's interesting to get insights into these people as individuals. Now, and I know you've had access to a lot of presidential letters and so on. I guess famously Martha Washington burned all of Washington's letters to her after his death. Was that a common practice, or was this unique?
No, it was fairly common for people for the surviving spouse to burn the letters of their spouse. Jefferson destroyed letters he exchanged with his wife, Martha. And so it wasn't unusual. These were usually very personal letters, and usually the wives had a lot of influence with the husbands. And I think that I did a collection of letters between presidents and their wives, and a lot of them offer insights that you don't normally see of a president or their wife, because they're trying to keep a public face. So when they're conversing with their wives, and letters in the 18th and early 19th century were conversations, because there were no telephones, people were at a distance. They exchanged letters and carried on a conversation. And that this, you really get, as you say, a really personal view of famous people who were celebrities at the time.
Well, does it concern you that future historians won't have access to these diaries and letters because of email and the electronic environment?
Well, it does, because the letters started tailing off after the invention of the telegram, which was 120 years ago, the use of it anyway. And then the telephone. Now we have the email, we have communications that disappear, we have Snapchat, Instagram, all these things. And it was a challenge when I was working at the Library of Congress. We were trying to figure out how to preserve the materials for future research. And one of the ways that we would do it would be to print out letters from tape recorders, this sort of thing. But now they try to preserve emails and electronic things, but there are so many that it's going to be pretty.
Well, short of printing it out, because the medium changes so often that even if you saved it electronically in 100 years, you might not be able to read it because you wouldn't have the equipment. So.
Yeah, well, some of the early electronic preservation tapes were really wires. The early recordings were done on taped wires. The library has a lot of those that they try to preserve. And all electronic things has to be refreshed, as they say, periodically, or it disappears. Mm-hmm. And basically, as you said, in 100 years, they'll have different devices. The ones we have now will disappear. Laptops, computers have gone through so many changes that materials on the early computers cannot be read by the later computers. It's going to be pretty hopeless, I think.
Oh, interesting. Wow. From a historical point of view, that's kind of frightening. Now, one of your books, Circle of Friends, Thomas Jefferson and his women correspondents. Now, Jefferson is an interesting character, and it must be fascinating to read those letters to get an insight into his character.
Well, I think it does, because it shows a different side of Jefferson. I think a side that people should be acquainted with, but they're really not. And I think that nowadays Jefferson is thought of as a slave owner, a misogynist, even a sexual predator in his relationships with women. But if you look at the correspondence Jefferson had with women, you see a totally different picture. He took them very seriously. He wrote often about politics with women around the world, not just his daughters or his sister-in-laws or friends, but friends that he made when he was the ambassador to France, he kept throughout his entire life. He wrote to people like Madame de Tesse, Madame de Staël, Maria Causeway, and Bingham, a large number of people that he met. And they show a Jefferson, a different side of Jefferson, a person who tried to become friends with people and who engaged them in conversations, written conversations, as best he could. He tried to find out what they were interested in. He would write back and forth. For example, he and Madame de Tesse exchanged seeds and plants and trees. And to Madame de Staël, he wrote about political writings because she was a political writer. And so he worked hard at becoming friends. And because he was a widower, he had no wife to maintain relationships with women. He had to do it himself. And one of the main ways he did it was through his letters.
Now, typically, how long would these letters run?
Well, I guess the longest one, his most famous letter, which is called The Head and Heart, he wrote to Maria Causeway. It was about 18 pages. But he wrote a lot of letters to Elizabeth House Trist, a woman that he met when he was staying at his mother's boarding house, her mother's boarding house in Philadelphia. They would run 5 or 6 pages. And that is an exchange of letters that I found particularly interesting, so interesting that I ended up writing a separate book about Elizabeth House Trist. But Jefferson would regularly write letters. They would exchange letters once or twice a year. It's not like they were writing them every day. But he maintained correspondence with women throughout their life.
Now, would he do this by hand, or would he have a secretary to whom he would dictate?
Well, he wrote everything by hand. He had a machine, was a copier machine, which he called a polygraph machine, which would make another copy. So you'd be writing, and it had a separate pen, like you're writing here. There's another pen and pencil over here, and it's making another copy. But he wrote them all himself. He didn't dictate
early copying
them.
machine.
Exactly. Yeah, early Xerox, think of it as.
That's fascinating. Now, I know you have another book about first daughters and their letters to the presidents. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I actually started, the idea for that book actually came from my daughter Anne, who was going through the exhibit I had curated on Thomas Jefferson, and she saw an exchange of letters between Jefferson and his daughter Martha, and she said, you know, you really ought to do something about presidents and their daughters. It'd make a really good book. So she and I did this book together called First Daughters. It's a book of letters between presidents and their daughters. And it shows a different side of presidents. We all see the public side, and then we know a little bit about their relationship with their wives, but with their children, it's totally different. And you get to see a kind of the cutesy side of presidents and an instructive side where they're trying to tell their daughters how they should behave, tell them how they should study, and the daughters write back, and usually it's their informal letters, but sometimes they're letters where they're trying to tell their fathers what to do. Martha Jefferson's forever writing to her father, trying to tell him how he should get out of debt. And other daughters write to their fathers and try to give them political advice. And so it's an interesting exchange.
Oh, no, it sounds absolutely fascinating. And I wish we had more time because there's just such a wealth of material here. I want to thank you for coming on. We have a little gift for you, our book, Historic Cemeteries of Northern Virginia.
Oh, well, good.
There
It's an
are
interesting.
some presidents in there.
There are, and it reminds me that Jefferson's friend, Elizabeth House Trist, who lived at Monticello for several years with Jefferson, is buried at the cemetery at Monticello, but there's no grave. There's no gravestone, so nobody really knows she's buried there.
Thanks again for coming in, and we want to
Thank you.
thank you for tuning in to Virginia Time Travel, your portal of the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.